Damiens was a domestic servant who had worked in several noble households. On January 5, 1757, he approached the king outside the Palace of Versailles and stabbed him with a small knife. The blade caused a shallow wound, and the king survived. The act was classified as regicide, which carried the most severe legal punishment in France. He was arrested immediately and taken into custody. During interrogation, he was placed on the rack, which stretched his body to force a confession. His legs were also subjected to boot torture, where wooden boards were tightened with wedges to compress them. Officials repeated these methods to obtain the names of accomplices. Damiens continued to state that he had acted alone. The court issued a sentence that specified a multi-stage public execution. On the day of the execution, he was taken to the Place de Grève, the main execution site in Paris. A large crowd was present to witness the punishment. The execution began with his body restrained in position. Heated metal instruments were applied as part of the sentence. Molten substances, including lead and sulfur, were poured onto specific areas as ordered by the court. Each step was carried out in sequence, following the written judgment. The final stage required teams of horses to pull his body apart. Ropes were attached to each limb and connected to the horses. The initial attempts failed to complete the process due to insufficient force and coordination. The executioners stopped, adjusted the bindings, and used additional cutting to assist the process. Multiple attempts were required before the sentence was completed. The executions lasted for an extended period and required repeated adjustments to carry out each stage. After completion, the remains were disposed of according to the judgment, and his property was confiscated. Bruno was a former Dominican friar and philosopher who promoted ideas about an infinite universe and multiple worlds. He rejected several core teachings of the Catholic Church and openly defended his views in public debates and writings. His ideas spread across Europe, bringing him into conflict with religious authorities. He was arrested in 1592 in Venice and later transferred to Rome. He remained imprisoned for approximately 8 years while the Roman Inquisition conducted his trial. During this period, he was repeatedly questioned and ordered to renounce his belief. He refused to fully recant despite multiple opportunities. The court found him guilty of heresy and sentenced him to death. On the day of the execution, he was taken to the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. His tongue was restrained with a device to prevent him from speaking to the crowd. He was tied to a stake in the center of the square. Wood and combustible materials were arranged around him to form the execution structure. The fire was lit at the base and allowed to spread upward. The execution was carried out publicly and lasted until death occurred from sustained exposure to heat and smoke. After the execution, his remains were burned completely, and the ashes were dispersed. The process ensured no physical remains could be preserved or collected. Vlad III ruled Wallachia and led military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and internal rivals. He used empalement systematically to punish enemies, enforce authority, and deter rebellion. Large numbers of prisoners, including soldiers and captured opponents, were executed using this method. The execution process involved driving a wooden stake through the body of the victim. The stake was positioned to avoid immediate death, allowing the victim to remain alive for an extended period. The body was then raised vertically so that the full weight of the body increased the pressure over time. Victims remained conscious for varying lengths of time, depending on the placement of the stake and the rate of internal damage. Death occurred gradually due to internal injury, blood loss, and exposure. The process could last for many hours or longer before death occurred. The bodies were left on display after death, arranged in large numbers along roads and near settlements. These displays were used to create a visible warning and reinforce control over the population and opposing forces. Ravaillac was a Catholic fanatic who believed the king's policies favored Protestants. On May 14, 1610, he approached the king's carriage in Paris and stabbed him multiple times, causing his death. He was arrested immediately at the scene and taken into custody. He was interrogated over several days to determine if he had accomplices. Officials used torture methods to extract information, including applying pressure to his body and using heated instruments. He did not provide names of collaborators and maintained that he had acted alone. The court sentenced him to a public execution designed in multiple stages. On the day of execution, he was taken to the Place de Grève, where a large crowd gathered. The punishment began with his body restrained while heated tools were applied according to the sentence. Molten substances were poured onto specific areas as ordered. The final stage involved tying his limbs to teams of horses. The horses were driven in opposite directions to pull his body apart. The process required coordination and multiple attempts before completion. The execution lasted for an extended period and followed the sequence defined by the court. After completion, the remains were disposed of according to the judgment. Anne Askew was a Protestant reformer who openly rejected key Catholic doctrines enforced under Henry VIII. She preached her beliefs publicly and refused to accept the doctrine of transubstantiation. Her activities brought her under investigation by religious authorities. She was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. During interrogation, officials attempted to force her to name other Protestants. She was subjected to torture on the rack, which stretched her body and caused severe physical damage. The injuries were significant enough that she could no longer walk or stand. The court found her guilty of heresy and sentenced her to execution by burning. On the day of execution, she was taken to Smithfield in London. Because she could not stand, she was carried to the site and placed against the stake. Chains were used to secure her in position. Wood and fuel were arranged around her body to form the execution structure. The fire was lit at the base and allowed to spread upward. She remained restrained throughout the process. Death occurred from sustained exposure to heat and smoke. After the execution, the remains were burned completely. The execution was carried out publicly as part of the enforcement of religious law under the crown. Klostermayer, known as the Bavarian Heassel, led a group that carried out raids across southern Germany. He targeted tax collectors, merchants, and officials, gaining local support among peasants while being pursued by regional authorities. His activities made him one of the most wanted outlaws in Bavaria. He was captured after being wounded during a confrontation with soldiers. After his arrest, he was taken into custody and held for trial. Authorities charged him with multiple crimes, including armed robbery and resistance to state forces. The court sentenced him to execution by breaking on the wheel, a method designed to prolong punishment. On the day of execution, he was brought to the public execution site in Dillingen. He was secured to a wooden wheel as part of the procedure. The executioner used an iron bar to strike his limbs in a set sequence, targeting arms and legs one after another. Death occurred after an extended period following the execution process. Bruce worked as a cook in the household of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. In February 1531, he prepared a meal that was later consumed by members of the household. Several people who ate the food became severely ill, and 2 died. The incident was treated as deliberate poisoning. He was arrested and charged under a special law introduced by Henry VIII that classified poisoning as high treason. This law specified boiling alive as the method of execution for such crimes. Roos was taken to Smithfield in London for the execution. A large cauldron filled with liquid was prepared over a fire. The liquid was heated to boiling temperature as part of the execution setup. He was placed into the boiling liquid and kept there as the punishment was carried out. The method caused prolonged exposure to extreme heat rather than immediate death. The execution was conducted publicly as required by the sentence. The process continued until death occurred. The execution was recorded as one of the earliest uses of boiling as a legal method of execution in England. Giles Corey was an elderly farmer who had been accused of witchcraft during the Salem proceedings. Under the legal system at the time, a defendant had to enter a plea before a trial could proceed. Corey refused to plead guilty or not guilty, which prevented the court from conducting a trial or confiscating his property through conviction. Because he refused to plead, the court ordered a punishment known as pressing. He was taken to an open field and placed on the ground. A wooden board was laid across his body, and heavy stones were placed on top of the board to apply pressure. The weight was increased gradually over time rather than applied all at once. Additional stones were added in stages to intensify the pressure on his body. The process continued for an extended period instead of causing immediate death. Corey remained under this pressure for 2 days. On September 19th, after prolonged pressure, he died without ever entering a plea. His property was not confiscated. Bragadin was the Venetian military governor of the city of Famagusta on the island of Cyprus. He led the defense of the city against a large Ottoman army for nearly a year. The defenders resisted repeated attacks and held the city despite limited supplies and reinforcements. By August 1571, food, ammunition, and manpower inside the city were exhausted. Bragadin agreed to surrender the city under terms negotiated with the Ottoman commander Lala Mustafa Pasha. The agreement included safe passage for surviving defenders. After the surrender, the terms were not honored. Bragadin was taken into custody and held prisoner. He was subjected to repeated physical punishment over a period of days. On the day of execution, he was brought to a public location in Famagusta. The execution was carried out as a staged process rather than a single act. The method involved removing the skin from his body while he was still alive, extending the duration of the execution. After his death, his remains were displayed publicly. The execution was recorded as a punishment following the siege and surrender of the city. John Hus was a religious reformer who criticized practices of the Catholic Church and called for changes in doctrine and authority. His teaching spread widely in Bohemia and influenced political and religious movements. His public criticism brought him into conflict with church authorities. He was summoned to the Council of Constance to answer charges against him. He traveled under a promise of safe conduct, but was arrested upon arrival. He was held in prison for several months while the council conducted hearings. During this period, he was repeatedly ordered to recant his teachings. He refused to fully withdraw his views. The council found him guilty of heresy and sentenced him to death. On the day of execution, he was taken to a field outside Constance. His priestly garments were removed. He was formally stripped of his clerical status. He was tied to a stake with chains to prevent movement. Wood and other fuel were arranged around his body to form the execution structure. The fire was lit and allowed to burn continuously. The execution was carried out publicly and lasted until death occurred from sustained exposure to heat and smoke. After the execution, his remains were burned completely. Joan of Arc was a peasant from Domremy who claimed to receive visions directing her to support Charles VII of France. She joined the French forces during the 100 Years' War and played a key role in lifting the siege of Orléans in 1429. She later accompanied Charles VII to Reims for his coronations, strengthening his claim to the throne. Her actions gave her significant influence despite her age and background. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces during a military campaign near Compiègne. The Burgundians transferred her to English authorities, who sought to discredit her and remove her influence. She was taken to Rouen and placed on trial under the authority of an ecclesiastical court aligned with the English. She was held in prison for several months and questioned repeatedly about her visions and actions. The court demanded that she renounce her claims. She initially signed a document of abjuration under pressure, but later withdrew it, which led to her being declared a relapsed heretic. The court then sentenced her to death. On the day of execution, she was taken to the market square in Rouen. A large crowd gathered, including English soldiers and local officials. She was tied to a wooden stake, and wood was arranged around her body to form the execution structure. The fire was lit at the base and allowed to spread upward. The execution was carried out publicly. Hugh Despenser the Younger was a powerful noble who became the closest advisor to King Edward II. He gained control over large lands and wealth through royal favor. His influence over the king allowed him to dominate court politics and expand his authority over other nobles. His actions created strong opposition among the English barons and the Queen. In 1326, Queen Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer invaded England with military support. Edward II's forces collapsed quickly. Despenser fled with the king but was captured near Neath in Wales after attempting to escape by sea. He was taken to Hereford for trial. The charges included treason, abuse of power, and unlawful seizure of property. The court sentenced him to a public execution designed to punish him in stages. On the day of execution, he was dragged behind a horse through the streets to the execution site. He was placed on a scaffold in front of a large crowd. The sentence began with his body restrained, while punishment was carried out in sequence according to the judgment. He was hanged, but removed before death occurred. The execution continued with further physical punishment, carried out step by step. The final stage involved his body being divided as part of the sentence. After the execution, the body parts were distributed to different locations for display. William Wallace was a Scottish military leader who led resistance against English rule during the Wars of Scottish Independence. He commanded Scottish forces to victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, defeating a larger English army. In 1305, he was captured near Glasgow by Scottish knight John de Menteith and handed over to English authorities. He was transported to London to stand trial. He was charged with treason against the English crown. Wallace argued he had never sworn loyalty to Edward I, but the court found him guilty. He was sentenced to execution by hanging, drawing, and quartering, a method used for high treason. On the day of execution, he was dragged through the streets of London to Smithfield behind a horse. At the execution site, he was hanged but removed before death occurred. The sentence continued with further stages carried out in sequence as defined by the court. The final stage involved dividing his body into parts. After the execution, his head was displayed on London Bridge, and his body parts were sent to different cities for public display. John Cullis was a Protestant merchant living in Toulouse, a city with strong Catholic influence. He managed a cloth business and lived with his family, including his son Marc-Antoine Cullis. The family's religious background placed them under social pressure in a region where Protestantism was restricted. On October 13, 1761, Marc-Antoine was found dead in the family home. Authorities suspected that John Cullis had killed him to prevent a conversion to Catholicism. Cullis was arrested along with members of his household. During interrogation, he denied the accusation and maintained that his son had died by suicide. The court convicted him of murder and sentenced him to execution by breaking on the wheel. On the day of execution, he was taken to the public square in Toulouse. He was secured to a wooden frame as part of the procedure. The executioner used an iron bar to strike his limbs in a set sequence. The blows were delivered in stages rather than all at once. The process was designed to extend the punishment instead of causing immediate death. After the blows, his body was placed on the wheel for display. Death occurred after the execution process was completed. The case later became widely known due to disputes over the verdict and questions about the evidence used in his conviction. Balthasar Gerard was a Catholic supporter of the Spanish crown during the Dutch Revolt. He believed William of Orange was a traitor to Philip II of Spain and decided to assassinate him. He gained access to William by presenting himself as a loyal supporter. On July 10, 1584, he approached William in Delft and shot him with a pistol at close range, causing his death. Gerard was captured immediately after the attack while attempting to escape. He was taken into custody and interrogated by authorities in Delft. The court sentenced him to a public execution for the assassination of a political leader. Before the execution, he was subjected to torture as part of the punishment. His body was exposed to repeated physical penalties carried out over a period of time. The sentence required multiple stages to be completed before death. On the day of execution, he was brought before a public audience. The punishment continued with additional physical measures carried out in sequence according to the judgment. The final stage involved execution after the completion of the torture process. The execution was prolonged and carried out publicly. The case was recorded as a punishment for the assassination of a major political figure during the Dutch Revolt.